Hi, I'm Chris. You've found one of my channels. In my last video, I considered the ethics of killing someone who deliberately causes suffering and death to others. I got a few objections that the killing of people like Charlie Kirk, who provide ideological cover for the right wing's policies that target vulnerable people, would lead the right wing to start a civil war, or at least ramp up the violence. I realized there are still a lot of people out there who don't know the right wing is already at war. It might not look like a war. It looks like a number of separate incidents or forces. ICE kidnappings, mass shootings, Nazi rallies, troops occupying cities, airstrikes on boats in the Caribbean. But they're linked. They're all part of assuming unchecked power. This video should help you understand what's going on and why, and what to do about it before it's too late. A Nazi-flavored, Christian nationalist, right populist movement has taken over the United States. Its win marked the culmination of at least 2 decades of far-right organizing. They popped up in every chat room, spreading their talking points in the US, in Europe, and everywhere. When refugees started coming to Europe from Syria and elsewhere in Africa and the Middle East, these folks took advantage of the state's mishandling of the crisis to make refugees the new group to hate on. They pushed for cutting off all migration and even refugees. Well, not all refugees, just real ones. The right wing in Europe came up with the idea of remigration, forcibly removing people, even if it's to some overcrowded prison in a country they've never been to. And that's just what the US is doing now. The anti-freedom of movement has been helping the far right take power all over. As they spread their influence, the right mounted a campaign to tell everyone gay and trans people were preying on their kids. They pushed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, conformity to arbitrary gender roles, and the return to a past that never existed. This is one of their memes, isn't it? It was all underpinned by the idea that white men were losing their position at the top of the hierarchy to women and racialized people, so it was okay to do whatever you want to stop them. The left observed and researched them and put up a fight when they came to town, but ultimately failed to stop them from taking the White House. During his first presidential run, 10 years ago now, Trump gave voice to people who had absorbed these far-right messages about black people and brown people and Asian people and Muslims and gay people and trans people and women in general. Where Trump spoke, violence followed. There's a link to this study in the description. Clearly, people took Trump's public expressions of bigotry and misogyny as license to bully their favorite targets. That way they could reassert their dominance over people they think are beneath them. I guess they were just waiting for someone in authority to give them superficially plausible reasons. They also started engaging in mass murder more. You might not have noticed the ideological color of mass shootings. The media often don't mention the killer's motives. They might not find out until later. Not all, maybe not even most, mass shooters are fueled by far-right ideas. But those ideas are definitely creating mass shooters. Mass shooters are often angry young men who feel slighted, who want revenge for perceived injustices against them or against some abstract entity they identify with, like a country, race, or gender. Well, doesn't that just sound like every shooter's manifesto? Something like 60% of mass shooters were committing acts of domestic violence or were men with a history of domestic violence. Researchers say many mass shooters are driven by a distorted view of masculinity, believing that being a real man requires aggression and domination. Some feel shame over men's diminished status in the economic and social order, which they take out on the women in their lives. When it comes to male mass shooters, said Hamline University criminology professor Gillian Peterson, many think that the world owes me more than what I have. Having embraced the radicalizing message of misogyny that blames a class of people, women, for their own perceived loss of social status, these aggrieved men are primed to accept the ideology of white supremacy, which analogously claims communities of color and Jewish people are conspiring to strip white people of their social status. Members of the far right take advantage of the naturally close relationship between misogyny and white supremacy to spread their own ideas, inundating these spaces with both misogyny misogynistic and racist attitudes. The result is that white supremacy and misogyny are core features of many right-wing extremist movements. In addition to these attitudes being common in online spaces, they're also observable in many attackers whose violence was motivated by hate. And if you conduct a successful bout of mass murder, you get famous in online Nazi incel communities. They become martyrs and models to follow and outdo. Lots of shooter manifestos reference the murder of Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019 because they want to be like that guy. More and more young men are signing up to kill for the Nazi death cult. But it's not just mass shooters who are killing for the power of white men. Smaller scale wannabe hero vigilantes murder people too, sometimes in their neighborhoods, sometimes on public transport in front of everyone, sometimes at the border, and sometimes they get acquitted or pardoned. COVID came along in 2020 and the racist right took advantage of it to spread fear of Asian people, leading to a marked uptick in violence against them that hasn't abated. A few months later, the same people defiantly stood on the steps of government buildings with guns and no masks to show they didn't care how many people died as long as they didn't have to protect their own health. This is the lack of empathy the right wing prides itself on today. Trump was ousted in 2021, but the right wing didn't take this time to reflect and mend its ways. It didn't slow down with the murdering. The Biden White House repealed some of Trump's worst policies, but treated campus protests against Israel's genocide of Gaza like they were terrorists. Campus protests are where a movement can start. Left unchecked, they could have slowed down Israel's war machine. They could have led to a broader movement for liberation. We can't have that. So when Trump came back to the White House, he followed the Project 2025 people's recommendations and designated all protests against Israel as anti-Semitic and therefore a reason to crack down on them. The government uses ICE to silence critics of Israel like Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeysa Öztürk. I'm not aware if they've done anything to actual anti-Semites who criticize Israel like these two. Why would they? They form part of Trump's base. But critics of Israel who aren't anti-Semitic are bound to also be opposed to a belligerent right-wing state in the US, so you gotta silence them. But along with dealing with its enemies, the White House has been using ICE to remove people from the country for not being white. Borders provide all kinds of excuses for an authoritarian state. Some drugs come across this enormous border because people want to buy them? Better pay $1 trillion to set up a security cordon around the entire country patrolled by forces that report to the president. Those forces can operate anywhere within the border, as anything to do with transportation or people from other countries falls within their mandate. They can be as large as budget and recruitment allow for, so the White House is raising the budget and recruiting younger. The border provides juicy billion-dollar contracts for buddies of the government like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. It's a big part of the surveillance state, which we've been told not to worry about because it'll only be used against really bad people. Definitely not you. But everyone has to go through the checkpoints and traffic stops and, oh hey, look, they've already killed someone. I don't want to go too much into what ICE is doing here because I talked about it in another video. Suffice it to say, it's integral to the creation of an ethno-state. ICE and the police make it legal and profitable to terrorize communities who you've decided don't deserve to live under your order. And because ICE dresses for maximum anonymity, copycat civilians have been able to rob, assault, and kidnap people. ICE and the state bear a huge amount of responsibility for this situation, but then, being white supremacists, it was likely an intended outcome. People who care this much about power will do pretty much anything to get it. Where they can get away with it, they assault, kill, arrest, kidnap, and traffic people. But they can't do that to everyone, and they wouldn't want to, because then who would they have power over? So they also just get people fired, or silence them, or bankrupt them. Censorship and punishing non-conformity to Trump's will has been a big part of his presidency. This year, Trump has pressured and sued law firms, universities, and media outlets on virtually any pretext. His government is calling all kinds of people terrorists, certainly anti-fascists, because anti-fascism would imply opposing pretty much everything the Trump government is doing. And the fact that some people listening are thinking, Aren't anti-fascists like a street gang who goes around beating up people who disagree with them? Shows how influential right-wing messaging has been. The government is even trying to outlaw possessing anarchist zines. Because, anarchists are terrorists too. ICE arrested Daniel Sanchez for protesting them while possessing literal insurrectionist propaganda titled "Organizing for Attack, Insurrectionary Anarchy," which you definitely should not look up or read or print and distribute. What was it called again? Organizing for Attack, Insurrectionary Anarchy? I'll put a link in the description so you know what to steer clear of. The right-wing's complaints about DEI have always just been about marginalizing anyone who isn't a white man. It might not have been clear before the second Trump administration, but it's undeniable now. They use the language of meritocracy, but that's because they believe being a white man is merit enough. The biggest victims of their purges have been black women, 300,000 of whom have been fired this year. That's who the right wing means when they say DEI. When they say they hate DEI or wokeness, they mean black women. The government has encouraged other bureaucrats to quit too, so it can fill vacated seats with fellow racists. But it's not just race people are getting fired for. Right-wingers love to snitch on anyone who doesn't follow their orthodoxy. You might have heard me mention the Professor Watch List run by TPUSA, which exists to get professors around the US harassed and fired for talking about things like what Israel is doing, or the obvious systemic racism in the US. Right-wingers tried to get everyone who celebrated Charlie Kirk's death or just pointed out the horrible things he said and did fired too. This week they contrived a reason to get a trans professor in Oklahoma fired. A student named Samantha Fulnecki wrote a paper that did not answer the assignment and cited the Bible as a source and got a bad mark, so she proceeded to claim religious discrimination because the professor was trans. The story went around the online right-wing grievance circuit, getting shared by sadistic bigots like libs of TikTok. There are links in the description to an article outlining what happened and another about the network of activists trying to ruin the lives of people with any influence who go against their dogma. So it's a campaign to silence people and push them out of public life so only wealthy conservative men have any influence. But it's also a kind of affirmative action for white underachievers. They're trying to make it easy for such people to get degrees without doing the work to earn them. If you don't give me a good mark, I'll send 1 million online trolls after you. If you don't give me a position of power in the university, I'll sue you for discrimination against me as a white Christian. If you're poor and unemployed, you're easier to control. The right has many ways it tries to control people and their bodies, especially women. A lot of these right-wingers send out death threats and other threats to women it doesn't like. How dare you have an opinion? Threats and real violence plague the lives of many women. Abortion bans are another method of control, and like all legal regulation of the body, it gets people killed. Same with denying trans people hormones. The anti-vaxxer movement has never been purely right-wing, but now that the right is in power, it's making up lies about vaccines so people can't get them. Preventing people from accessing healthcare is violence. Legal violence is still violence. It's the threat of police pointing guns in your face and then putting you in a cage. I'm sure everyone knows Trump is invading cities on the US mainland and threatening governors and mayors who don't want him to, and how bonkers that is. The far right does not brook any opposition, just obedience. But no oppressive system is content to just invade its own land. When they want power, there's no limit to how far people will go. When they have the largest military the world's ever witnessed, they're gonna use it. Trump has publicly pondered attacking and annexing places like Panama and Greenland, and barely trying to justify it, as if to say, we don't need a reason. We're the United States. So the US military has blown up at least 20 boats in the Caribbean so far, alleging that they're drug smugglers or narco-terrorists, as they put it in their usual eye-rollingly over-the-top rhetoric. They've supplied no evidence for their claim. Recently, they said one of the boats was under the control of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. They've provided no evidence for that claim. Even if they were drug smugglers, no one has explained the theory behind why death is the correct punishment for drugs. And if it is, why did Trump pardon the former president of Honduras, a huge drug smuggler? So, is the goal regime change in Venezuela? Is it that time of year already? Trump claims to need to kill people because they're bringing drugs into our country and the government refuses to stop the narco-terrorists, so we've got to depose it. Sounds like traditional US foreign policy logic, but it's being justified with the new rhetoric of cruelty, rather than through appeal to empty liberal ideals like before. When we listen to these right-wingers on campus, on YouTube, and now on TV, we're not hearing just an opinion. It's a set of opinions derived from far-right propaganda that gets people killed. Anyone trying to minimize the effect of what they say is dismissing the huge amounts of harm their words and policies cause. It's just an opinion until it's a threat. So what do we do about it? Long term, we want to end this war like we want to end all war. But it's not an easy task. It requires us to tackle the conditions that make war possible, from the institutions that enable and incentivize waging war to the foul ideologies behind them. I've talked a lot about this long-term goal before, so you can check the links in the description to get a better idea. We can take steps toward a revolutionary future by fighting oppression in the present. Some people have unlimited faith in the system that they have, after all, been assured their whole lives is the ideal democracy that couldn't fail. Trump must be a blip that the system will correct for. Please lose this faith. It was never warranted. It is transparently baseless now that the mask has fallen and the right wing is attempting to create a white supremacist, male-dominated Christian theocracy. They will succeed if you don't stop them. Cheryl Weichel says, I continue to believe that the biggest problem with the United States is that our reaction to injustice is to ask, how is this allowed? Instead of, why are we allowing this? The first is waiting for a superhero to come and save us. The second is resolving to join together and save ourselves. Then there are the people who recognize there's a problem but caution you against doing anything effective because it might provoke them. When people warn you not to poke the bear, i.e. to give the state or the right wing a reason to go after you, they don't seem to realize the people we're talking about don't need another reason. Or if they do, they'll make it up. This movement will never be satisfied. If you acquiesce, it'll just take more. The bear is wide awake. Why aren't you? Stop tiptoeing and pick up the bear spray. To effectively counter the state and the right wing, we need to organize too. I know I quote him a lot, but MLK said, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. No King's protests show people are angry, but they don't really do anything to stop the state or the right. It's one thing to mobilize people for one day to protest or protect people from violence, but it needs to lead to longer-term cooperation among people and groups. Between 5 and 7 million people came out for No Kings. Imagine if they were united by the vision of a world where no one could become a dictator or a king or wage war because the people wouldn't let them, ever. It's possible. The links are in the description. I'm also including a link to a list of various acts of nonviolent resistance we could do. Because despite everything I said in my last video, violence is not necessarily the answer. It depends what the question is. There are so many possible paths of resistance open to us. You should find the ones you want to pursue, maybe because of how urgent it is, or how much good you can do, or its strategic value. If you're not sure where you belong, look for a local organization that's housing the homeless, resisting evictions, freeing people from prison, or some other kind of mutual aid. If you can't act locally, you can do stuff online. Mutual aid is always necessary, but it's also a way of fighting back against the people trying to drag you into a war. They want to kill off vulnerable people. Standing up for them is resisting the right wing. If you provide free healthcare, abortions, or vaccines, you're resisting the right wing. When you stand between ICE and their victims, you're resisting the right wing. Trashing an ICE recruitment station is resisting them. Trashing the offices of their corporate sponsors like Palantir is too. Find people, organize, fight back.